It was the end of a long Moscow winter when the first shafts were sunk into the frozen ground near the Kremlin. The year was somewhere in the late 1950s, and the city above hummed with the noise of renewal, trams rattling down icy boulevards, loudspeakers praising industrial triumphs, parades marching beneath red banners that promised a radiant future. Yet under the surface, away from sunlight and applause, hundreds of men labored in silence. They worked in shifts that never touched daylight, carving tunnels through damp clay and ancient stone. Their contracts carried no addresses, their pay came in cash, and the documents they signed forbade them from speaking about their work for the rest of their lives. To most, it looked like another expansion of the Moscow metro, a project familiar to the Soviet worker. But the scale felt wrong, corridors wider than train tunnels, ceilings lined with thick steel plates, and ventilation ducts built to military specification. Whispers began to circulate. Some said the tunnels would lead to a bomb shelter for the party elite. Others believed they were digging a railway that could spirit government officials away from the capital should nuclear war erupt. The foreman offered no answers, the guards who patrolled the site said nothing at all. All the workers knew was a single cryptic designation stamped on every blueprint, D-6. In later years, Western analysts would give the project another name, Metro 2, the shadow twin of the public subway, a secret artery running beneath the city's official life. The concept had been born from fear. When the atomic age dawned, Stalin and his successors understood that the next war would not resemble the last. There would be no trenches, no distant front line, the first target would be Moscow itself. The United States possessed long-range bombers. Soon, both nations would wield intercontinental missiles capable of annihilating capitals in minutes. To ensure the continuity of command, the Kremlin needed a sanctuary that could survive the unthinkable. The Ministry of Defense and the KGB's Directorate of Special Construction were tasked with an impossible directive: design an underground world where government, military, and scientific leadership could endure for months after the surface was destroyed. Stalin had already set the precedent. His personal bunker at Izmailovo, connected by a private metro spur to the Kremlin, had been completed in the final years of his rule. But by the mid-1950s, with hydrogen bombs replacing atomic ones, a single refuge was no longer enough. Engineers began sketching plans for a self-sustaining network that could shelter up to 200,000 people, a miniature nation sealed beneath the earth. There would be dormitories, hospitals, power generators, and water reservoirs. Even cultural halls were proposed, so that survivors might preserve a sense of civilization while the world above lay in ruins. Officially, nothing of this appeared on maps. State newspapers spoke only of new metro extensions, while classified budgets hid the true expenses within the Ministry of Transport. Yet foreign intelligence agencies soon noticed anomalies: unexplained ventilation shafts near the Kremlin, restricted compounds labeled as geological research sites, and the peculiar behavior of Soviet survey teams working deep under the capital. By the late 1970s, the CIA's analytical division had coined the term Deep Metro System and speculated that it might connect the Kremlin to command centers at Remenki and Vnukovo Airport. If accurate, it meant the Soviet leadership had constructed not just bunkers, but an entire command civilization designed to rule from beneath a devastated surface. Above ground, life continued as if nothing existed below. Commuters waited for trains, unaware that only a few meters deeper, parallel tunnels branched into silence. Soldiers guarded sealed steel doors marked service access only, and no ordinary citizen ever passed beyond them. When the Soviet Union collapsed decades later, journalists began asking about the old rumors. One government spokesman, pressed for a comment, merely smiled and said, "These are matters of state security." It was not a denial, and it was all the confirmation anyone needed. To this day, no public map marks where the hidden lines run or how deep they go. Some claim the tunnels descend more than 200 meters, linking underground cities in a web designed to outlast nuclear fire. Whether legend or truth, the story endures because it reflects the same obsession that defined the Cold War itself, the fear that life on the surface could vanish in an instant, and that salvation, if it came at all, would come from beneath the Kremlin's stone foundations. In the decade following the Second World War, the world entered an age of anxiety unlike any before it. Cities rebuilt from ashes, empires dissolved, and the two surviving superpowers stared at each other across a shattered planet. The United States possessed atomic fire, the Soviet Union hungered to match it. When the first Soviet bomb detonated in 1949 over the Semipalatinsk test site, the explosion did more than even the scales. It ensured that humanity would live forever under the shadow of its own invention. From that moment, every scientific breakthrough became a weapon, and every city a potential target. The Cold War was no longer a political contest, it was a race to avoid extinction. In Moscow, the mood was a strange mix of triumph and dread. Stalin had proven that socialism could master the atom, yet he knew that America's industrial machine was still vastly superior. The Kremlin's intelligence briefings described fleets of American bombers on 24-hour standby, capable of reaching Soviet soil within hours. Civil defense planners warned that in the first wave of a nuclear exchange, Moscow would be hit by at least 20 megatons of destructive force. The question was no longer if the bombs would fall, but when. To survive, the leadership needed to think like engineers of the apocalypse. Throughout the 1950s, the Soviet Union poured resources into a colossal survival program. Thousands of bunkers were built beneath schools, factories, and apartment blocks. Air raid drills became routine, sirens wailing across the capital as citizens hurried underground in well-rehearsed silence. Posters instructed how to cover one's face from radioactive dust, how to seal windows with damp cloth, how to ration food for weeks. But the truth was known only to those in power. These public shelters could never withstand a direct strike. They were designed for morale, not salvation. The real protection would be reserved for the state, the party, the generals, the scientists who could rebuild civilization after the smoke cleared. By the time Nikita Khrushchev rose to power, nuclear strategy had evolved into an art of controlled terror. The West called it mutually assured destruction, the Soviets called it strategic balance. Either side could annihilate the other, yet neither dared to strike first. It was a peace sustained by fear, a balance held by the certainty of shared death. Khrushchev's public bravado, his threats to bury the West, concealed a private obsession with survival. He ordered the expansion of underground facilities not only in Moscow but across the entire Union, in Sverdlovsk, Novosibirsk, and beneath the Ural Mountains, where command posts and fuel reserves were buried beneath hundreds of meters of granite. American reconnaissance aircraft, flying at the edge of Soviet airspace, photographed odd construction sites and unusual rail lines leading nowhere. Analysts in Washington speculated that these were hardened communication centers or missile control hubs. Few imagined that deep beneath Red Square, an entirely different world was being carved into existence, a world designed to govern after the end. By the early 1960s, the fear of nuclear war had seeped into every layer of Soviet life. School children learned to crawl under desks during drills, families stored jars of pickled food and candles beside their radios. Every new missile test, every foreign crisis, felt like the prelude to an ending that never quite arrived. And yet the Kremlin's preparations continued. Beneath ministries, tunnels stretched farther, beneath metro lines, secret doors multiplied. Somewhere below the marble halls of the Kremlin itself, engineers and soldiers toiled in the stale air, assembling the nerve center of a future no one wanted to see. To the men who designed it, this was not madness but duty. Survival was the ultimate act of patriotism, a promise that the motherland would endure even when reduced to cinders. In that grim logic, the underground city became both ark and fortress, a sanctuary for power, not for people. Above ground, parades rolled through Red Square. Below, the concrete bones of a new civilization slowly took shape. By the mid-1950s, the Soviet Union had moved far beyond the idea of mere bunkers. What the Kremlin now envisioned was an engineered sanctuary, a subterranean fortress that could preserve the entire structure of government in the aftermath of nuclear annihilation. The project began under the bland and bureaucratic name Facility 42, but within intelligence circles, it became known as Operation Remenki, after the quiet district on Moscow's southwestern edge where construction first broke ground. On the surface, Remenki appeared to be just another residential neighborhood, dotted with modest apartment blocks and the occasional ministry building. Beneath it, however, Soviet engineers were carving out the foundations of a city designed to survive the end of the world. The orders came from the highest level. The Ministry of Medium Machine Building, the same institution responsible for the Soviet nuclear program, took control of the project, assisted by the KGB's Department of Special Construction. Only a handful of senior officials understood the full scope of the plan. What appeared to be an ordinary infrastructure development was, in reality, the central node of an underground network that would eventually connect the Kremlin, the Defense Ministry, and Vnukovo Airport through miles of fortified tunnels. Each sector of this hidden world had a designated purpose: command and control, communications, logistics, housing, and medical care. The Remenki complex itself was vast. According to later intelligence estimates, its main chamber stretched across several kilometers, descending in multiple layers like the decks of a buried ship. The upper levels contained administrative offices and sleeping quarters for government staff. Below that were technical zones, ventilation systems, diesel generators, water treatment plants, and an independent power grid capable of running for months without surface connection. Farther down still, behind reinforced blast doors, lay the command bunkers, windowless, circular halls filled with communication consoles and heavy steel desks where the remnants of government could direct what was left of the country. Construction was slow, dangerous, and cloaked in silence. Crews worked around the clock in rotating shifts, most believing they were building part of a new metro extension. The deeper sections were excavated by hand to minimize vibration that could be detected by Western seismic monitoring. Engineers slept in barracks sealed from the public, their correspondence screened and censored. Every delivery, steel, concrete, cable, was catalogued under a different civilian project name. Even within the bureaucracy, no single ministry possessed the complete blueprint. Only the Kremlin's General Directorate for Special Programs held the master plan, stored in a vault that required 3 separate security codes to open. Rumors inevitably spread among Moscow's citizens. Strange convoys of cement trucks arrived at night. Entire city blocks were fenced off without explanation. In nearby parks, locals heard the faint thud of machinery far below their feet. Some dismissed it as routine subway work, others whispered about the underground city, a myth that grew with every passing year. Yet a few people knew the truth, or at least part of it. Among them were military engineers who later defected to the West, describing a project so ambitious that American analysts doubted it could exist. One report from the CIA's Directorate of Science and Technology referred to Remenki as a probable command relocation site for the Soviet leadership, designed to sustain 10,000 to 20,000 personnel. In reality, those estimates barely scratched the surface. The deeper intention was not simply to protect individuals but to ensure the continuity of the state itself. Every document, every cipher, every protocol for launching missiles or broadcasting emergency orders had to be preserved in secure underground archives. The Soviet Union was not preparing for temporary shelter, it was preparing to function after civilization's collapse. Inside Remenki, entire rooms were devoted to food storage, hydroponic farms, and air regeneration systems. It was a technological marvel of its time, one built with the expectation that humanity above might perish. From the beginning, the engineers knew they were constructing more than a shelter. They were building the skeleton of a post-apocalyptic government, a second capital that would awaken when the first had turned to ash. By the late 1950s, Moscow had grown into one of the largest urban centers on Earth, a sprawling monument of Soviet ambition with marble subway halls and wide boulevards built to impress the world. Yet few among its 12 million citizens realized that directly beneath their feet, another city was taking shape. Hidden behind layers of classification, sealed by steel and silence, the so-called deep metro system began to expand far beyond the Remenki complex. What started as a defensive shelter had become a vast subterranean network, a parallel infrastructure of rails, tunnels, and command centers stretching beneath the capital. Western intelligence would eventually give it a name whispered with fascination and disbelief, Metro 2. The public metro, completed in the 1930s, was a marvel of socialist engineering, cathedrals of stone and light. Metro 2 was its mirror image, dark, narrow, and entirely off the record. It was never meant for commuters or tourists. Its corridors were lined with armored cables, blast doors, and coded signage. Its trains were smaller, built for speed rather than comfort, and painted in plain military grey. Only officers of the KGB, the Defense Ministry, and the General Staff held authorization to ride them. Even among Soviet insiders, few dared to speak of it aloud. Those who did referred to it by euphemisms, the service line, the deep route, the reserve metro. According to fragments of information that later surfaced, Metro 2 was composed of at least 4 main lines. One connected the Kremlin directly to Remenki, the nerve center of the underground government. Another led westward toward Vnukovo Airport, providing an evacuation corridor should Moscow face imminent destruction. A third line branched toward the Defense Ministry, ensuring continuous communication with Missile Command. The fourth remained the most mysterious, rumored to extend dozens of kilometers beyond the city limits to a remote military district buried beneath the forests near Odintsovo. From there, trains could carry key personnel to underground airfields or relocation zones in the Urals. Every element of the system was built with secrecy in mind. Access shafts were hidden within ordinary metro stations, disguised as maintenance areas or sealed behind heavy service doors. Emergency stairwells opened into anonymous storage rooms that no passenger ever noticed. The ventilation outlets on the surface were camouflaged as warehouses, garages, or even playground walls. Over time, these invisible apertures became part of Moscow's landscape, unnoticed relics of a parallel world. Western analysts first caught wind of the project through whispers from defectors and intercepted construction manifests. Satellite photographs revealed unusual ventilation grids and rail spurs that ended abruptly inside restricted zones. CIA reports from the 1970s concluded that a classified submetropolitan transport network existed beneath Moscow, though its full extent was unknown. One declassified memo speculated that the tunnels were built to ensure wartime continuity of the Soviet government, noting that their estimated depth, up to 250 meters, would shield them from the shockwaves of even the most powerful thermonuclear blasts. The idea that the Kremlin could survive while the surface turned to molten glass fascinated and horrified Western observers alike. Inside the USSR, meanwhile, Metro 2 was both myth and menace. Stories circulated among metro workers about empty trains that ran at night, unmarked and silent, vanishing into tunnels no one was allowed to enter. Some spoke of soldiers descending with suitcases, never to return. Others claimed that during major parades or state funerals, senior officials used the hidden line to move unseen through the capital. When questioned, the Ministry of Transport dismissed the rumors as bourgeois fantasy. Yet the silence itself only deepened the mystery. Even after the Cold War ended, the legend refused to die. Urban explorers who crept into disused maintenance tunnels sometimes found sealed iron doors, welded shut and humming faintly with the echo of distant machinery. Former officials, interviewed years later, hinted that the network was real but still active, modernized, expanded, and classified under a new generation of codes. Whether they were telling the truth or guarding an old secret, no one could be sure. Metro 2 had become more than a construction project. It was an idea, a symbol of the Soviet state's obsession with control, secrecy, and survival. To build a city beneath a city was to admit that the surface could never be trusted. Beneath the neon lights and granite towers of Moscow lay a darker reflection of the nation itself, a world of corridors, shadows, and silence, ready to outlive the one above. For those who designed it, the underground network beneath Moscow was more than a military installation, it was a civilization insurance policy. Deep under layers of concrete, steel, and secrecy, Soviet planners imagined a self-contained city that could outlast the apocalypse. The numbers were staggering. Rumenki alone, according to later estimates, could shelter nearly 200,000 people, government officials, scientists, military officers, and the essential workers who would keep the Soviet state alive while the surface turned to ash. To the outside world, it sounded like fantasy. But to the men and women tasked with building it, this was not science fiction, it was survival engineering. Within this buried metropolis, every human need was accounted for. There were dormitories stacked in narrow tiers, rows of bunks illuminated by dim fluorescent light. Canteens served preserved food shipped in sealed tins and dried rations meant to last for years. Vast air circulation chambers pooled filtered oxygen from the surface, while subterranean wells supplied clean water drawn from ancient aquifers. Engineers designed sewage systems with redundant pipes, knowing that even a minor failure could poison the entire complex. Nothing was left to chance. Every hallway, every cable, every door had a function. It was as if an entire miniature society had been assembled piece by piece, waiting only for the day it would be sealed shut. Power came from deep-cycle diesel generators, fed by massive fuel reserves hidden behind reinforced walls. The planners even created simulated day and night cycles using timed lighting to help residents maintain a circadian rhythm. Medical bays stocked with radiation medication, surgical equipment, and field laboratories stood ready to treat casualties who might arrive from the devastated surface. Somewhere within the command sector, vaults stored irreplaceable archives, scientific data, nuclear protocols, and state records, meant to preserve the continuity of the Soviet Union long after the world above had ended. Life in this hypothetical city would have been a strange mixture of order and despair. The inhabitants, sealed underground, would know that everything familiar, the sunlight, the streets, the seasons, had vanished in fire. Daily routines would replace panic, work shifts, maintenance schedules, briefings, meals, and sleep. Officers would issue orders, engineers would check oxygen levels, doctors would monitor radiation sickness. In its own grim way, the underground world was designed to be stable, even comfortable, at least compared to the chaos above. But the deeper one looks into the plan, the clearer its moral shadow becomes. The shelters were never meant for ordinary citizens. They were reserved for those deemed essential to state function. While millions would perish on the surface, a chosen few would inherit the darkness below. Still, the ambition behind it was undeniably immense. Soviet urban planners drew inspiration from the very metro stations they had already built, cathedrals of labor that doubled as symbols of progress. The same aesthetic discipline informed the underground city: smooth concrete arcs, polished tiles, the faint echo of footsteps in vast corridors. It was a place where ideology met engineering, where the fear of annihilation was transformed into a blueprint for endurance. To live there would be to exist in a suspended state, between survival and surrender, between the past civilization and whatever future might crawl out of the ruins. When Western analysts first learned of these population estimates, they were stunned. No other nation had attempted anything so vast. American civil defense programs could shelter officials in places like Cheyenne Mountain or Raven Rock, but none could house an entire command structure at this scale. To Washington, it was another sign of Soviet paranoia. To Moscow, it was the logical expression of faith in the system's permanence. The USSR could fall, cities could burn, but the party, in theory, would survive. That was the purpose of the city below, to guarantee that, even in death, the state would endure. Every empire hides its secrets behind walls, but the Soviet Union buried its deepest ones under concrete and silence. The underground city did not build itself. It was carved from the earth by thousands of men whose names never appeared in any record, whose existence was classified, and whose labor would remain invisible for generations. They were the shadow builders, the engineers, soldiers, and laborers who shaped the subterranean veins of Moscow's second city. Most came from military construction units or the Ministry of Medium Machine Building, drafted not for battle but for endurance. Others were political prisoners, men pulled from gulags in the Urals or the Far East, promised reduced sentences if they worked without question. They were loaded onto trains at night, transported to fenced compounds around Moscow, and handed shovels, drills, and gas masks. They toiled in damp, suffocating tunnels where air was thick with dust and the whine of pneumatic drills never stopped. The work was brutal and endless, and accidents were common. When they occurred, bodies were removed quietly, paperwork sealed, and replacements arrived before dawn. Supervision came from officers of the KGB's Special Construction Directorate. They enforced secrecy with an iron hand. Each crew worked in isolation, never seeing the entire plan, forbidden to discuss what they built. They were told it was for the protection of the motherland, an act of patriotic duty in the nuclear age. Many believed it. Others whispered that they were digging graves for the rest of humanity. Even engineers with high clearance rarely spoke of the moral weight that came with their task. They were designing sanctuaries that only the powerful would ever enter, fortresses meant for preservation of state, not the people. It was survival as privilege, written in concrete. Still, the builders took pride in their craft. Soviet engineering was both art and ideology, a faith in the mastery of human labor over nature. They measured walls with mathematical precision, poured reinforced concrete thicker than any metro line, and tested the blast resistance of every chamber as if the future depended on it, which, in their eyes, it did. Some nights, when drills went silent, men stood in the half-finished tunnels and listened to the city breathing above them, the muffled rumble of trams, the echo of church bells long outlawed, the faint laughter from the surface world they would never see again. Then they returned to work, burying that sound a little deeper with every swing of the pick. As decades passed, the generation that began the digging was replaced by another, scientists and planners from Moscow's technical institutes who refined the labyrinth into a functioning ecosystem. They calculated air turnover rates, studied the psychological limits of confinement, and tested light frequencies that could mimic sunlight underground. Everything from sleeping quarters to the placement of propaganda murals was considered. Even in catastrophe, the party insisted, morale must be maintained. In this sense, the underground city was as much a psychological experiment as an engineering feat. It asked, how long could a civilization live without the sky? Few of the original workers lived to see the network completed. Many disappeared into anonymous graves outside the capital, others simply went home and never spoke again. But their work endured, unseen, beneath the feet of millions. When later generations of Soviet citizens rode the metro or walked across Red Square, they unknowingly passed over the bones of the men who had built the city below. They were ghosts of progress, laborious of secrecy, architects of fear. History would not name them, yet every tunnel, every door, every corridor in the Kremlin's buried world bore the imprint of their hands. The Soviet Union may have glorified its rockets and its cosmonauts, but its true monument to endurance was dug in darkness, by men who would never be remembered. By the early 1960s, the Cold War had entered its most dangerous phase. The United States and the Soviet Union stood toe to toe, both armed with enough nuclear warheads to erase humanity several times over. The competition for global dominance had moved beyond ideology. It was now a countdown to survival. Every action, every miscalculation, could trigger the end. Inside the Kremlin, military planners spoke openly about the inevitability of nuclear conflict, not as theory but as destiny. For them, the underground city was no longer a precaution. It was a necessity. When American U-2 reconnaissance planes began photographing Soviet installations from the stratosphere, paranoia deepened. Every secret missile field, every test site, every shadow was being mapped from above. In response, Moscow doubled its efforts to expand the hidden infrastructure below. New tunnels were ordered, old ones reinforced. Entire ministries were instructed to create duplicate command centers underground, each capable of functioning independently if its surface counterpart was destroyed. The state's obsession was no longer only with weapons, it was with survival logistics, communications lines, food chains, fuel storage, and command continuity. Then came October 1962. The world held its breath as the Cuban Missile Crisis brought both superpowers to the edge of nuclear war. For 13 days, the fate of the planet balanced on human nerves. Inside the Kremlin Situation Room, Khrushchev's advisors discussed worst-case scenarios. Military couriers delivered sealed envelopes containing evacuation protocols for top leadership. In one scenario, the entire Presidium and their families would be relocated into the Remenki facility via Metro 2. Special trains, already waiting in hidden sidings, could be mobilized within minutes of a nuclear alert. Food and water reserves had been stocked, generators tested, medical teams placed on permanent standby. When Khrushchev finally agreed to withdraw the missiles from Cuba, Moscow celebrated publicly, but in the shadows, the lesson was clear: next time, luck might not intervene. From that moment, the Soviet bunker program exploded in scope. Throughout the 1960s and 1970s, new facilities were added to the deep network: command posts beneath the Urals, relocation hubs near Arzamas and Chelyabinsk, and communication tunnels that stretched for kilometers under the capital. Western analysts dubbed it the subterranean empire. To them, it appeared the Soviets were preparing not just to survive a nuclear war, but to govern through it. Intelligence memos described the Remenki site as capable of supporting 15,000 key personnel for up to 2 years. Others speculated that the entire network could hold nearly 200,000. To the American mind, the idea was both ingenious and terrifying, a government planning to rule a dead world. Meanwhile, in the United States, similar efforts were taking shape: Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado, Raven Rock in Pennsylvania, Mount Weather in Virginia. These bunkers mirrored the Soviet designs, self-sufficient, radiation-proof, and built to preserve continuity of government. Yet none approached the rumored scale of Moscow's network. To the Soviets, America's bunkers symbolized privilege; to Americans, the Kremlin's tunnels symbolized obsession. Both sides had transformed fear into architecture. As détente cooled and the nuclear stockpiles grew, Moscow continued to dig. The deeper the weapons went into the silos, the deeper the shelters went into the ground. Each crisis, Berlin, Prague, Afghanistan, reinforced the same logic: the apocalypse was always one step away, and survival belonged to those who prepared most thoroughly. Soviet citizens were told that socialism was eternal. In secret, the state ensured that eternity had a backup plan buried beneath the city. By the mid-1970s, the underground network had become an empire within an empire, sealed, guarded, and almost mythic. For those who knew of it, the tunnels symbolized both safety and surrender. They were proof that their leaders no longer believed the world could be saved, only survived. Above ground, the Soviet Union projected confidence, marching in parades beneath banners of peace. Below, in the flicker of fluorescent light, its true faith was revealed, not in diplomacy, but in endurance through destruction. Beneath the Kremlin's marble courtyards and onion domes, under the echo of soldiers' boots and the chiming of the Spassky Tower clock, lay something the public was never meant to see: a second Kremlin, hidden in the dark. It was a command citadel built not for ceremony or politics but for endurance. Where the upper Kremlin was made of stone, gold, and history, its underground twin was built from steel, concrete, and fear. This was the brain of the subterranean empire, the underground Kremlin, the nerve center of command that would take over the moment nuclear war began. Rumors of its existence surfaced as early as the 1960s, when a handful of Western analysts noticed ventilation shafts and power lines radiating outward from the Kremlin walls into restricted zones. Some thought they were for archives or storage. Others believed they concealed a network of elevators leading down to the War Command Hall, a fortified chamber said to rest hundreds of feet below Ivan the Great's bell tower. The Soviets never confirmed it, but everything about their infrastructure pointed to its reality. During crises, communications cables were rerouted underground. During parades, certain corridors were sealed, and power in specific districts was redirected to hidden substations beneath the Kremlin grounds. For those with the highest clearance, the underground Kremlin was both a bunker and a control center. It was designed to operate even if Moscow above lay in ruins. Within its blast-proof doors stood long corridors lined with reinforced concrete, leading to rooms filled with analog consoles, landline relays, and switchboards connecting to military command posts across the Union. In its deepest level was a circular chamber. Some described it as a steel hive, where the General Secretary and his advisors could convene in total isolation. Massive air filtration systems kept the pressure constant, and special ducts recycled oxygen for weeks without surface intake. In a nearby hall, generators rumbled continuously, ready to sustain the bunker indefinitely should the city above vanish. At the height of the Cold War, the entire communications architecture of the Soviet state was mirrored here. Dedicated lines linked the underground Kremlin directly to Remenki, to the general staff at Koroshayovskoye, and to missile silos spread across the steppe. The system was known internally as Kavkaz, a code name for the Secure Emergency Network. Its purpose was terrifyingly simple: to transmit the launch orders for the Soviet nuclear arsenal if all else failed. Through Kavkaz, buried beneath Moscow's soil, the state could still strike back, even if the Kremlin itself had become a crater. It was here, according to some reports, that senior officers rehearsed continuity drills. Teams would descend through restricted access tunnels, seal themselves inside for hours, and simulate the procedures of a nuclear exchange. The atmosphere inside was said to be both methodical and suffocating. Operators sat before their instruments, each one repeating the same phrase: signal received. Confirm command authority. There were no windows, no clocks, no natural sound, only the hum of machines and the awareness that these were the last links in a chain designed for doomsday. Western spies obsessed over this hidden fortress. CIA and NSA intercepts referred to it as Site Zero, a term borrowed from the mythology of nuclear command. Analysts speculated that the underground Kremlin might connect to deeper routes, Metro 2 lines that reached as far as Vnukovo Airport or even the missile defense hub at Odintsovo. Satellite imagery, thermal scans, and seismic readings offered clues but no certainty. The Soviets denied everything, insisting the allegations were imperialist fantasies. Yet whenever construction cranes appeared near Red Square or sections of the metro closed without warning, the rumors flared anew. In the 1980s, as tensions rose under Reagan and Andropov, Moscow intensified upgrades to its underground systems. Modern radio relay chambers replaced old cables, while armored blast doors were strengthened against higher shock loads. Some engineers spoke quietly of Level 4, a still deeper complex, built beneath the already hidden Kremlin. If it existed, it represented the ultimate evolution of Soviet paranoia, an entire government prepared to function from the grave of its own capital. Even after the Soviet Union's collapse, the underground Kremlin remained sealed, its entrances guarded and its purpose unspoken. Officials refused to comment, and researchers who asked too many questions often found themselves denied access to archives. Whatever lies beneath those ancient walls, it endures in silence, a buried heart still beating under Moscow's stones. When the Soviet Union finally began to fracture in the late 1980s, the world above was filled with noise, protests, speeches, collapsing economies, and the hollow echo of promises that no longer held weight. But beneath Moscow, inside the tunnels and sealed chambers of the underground city, there was only silence. The system still worked, the lights still flickered in corridors that no one visited, generators idled in standby mode, and filtered air continued to hum through ducts built for a war that never came. The empire that had built them was dying, yet its subterranean organs refused to stop beating. During the last years of perestroika, funding for secret military projects dried up. Engineers and soldiers assigned to special construction units were quietly reassigned or dismissed. Many of the entrances to the deep network were welded shut, marked as maintenance zones or sealed entirely under new developments. The men who had once carried top clearance badges simply vanished into civilian life, taking their knowledge with them. Officially, the underground complexes didn't exist. Unofficially, they had become relics of a vanished future, monuments to fear and control. When the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin in December 1991, no announcement was made about the fate of the bunkers below. The files remained classified, buried in the new bureaucracy of the Russian Federation. For a time, it seemed as though the network had been forgotten. The country above was too busy trying to survive its own collapse. Runaway inflation, food shortages, and political chaos consumed the surface world. Yet beneath it all, the tunnels still waited, unchanged, entombed beneath the foundations of a government that no longer existed. In the following years, fragments of the truth began to leak. Former workers, no longer bound by Soviet secrecy oaths, spoke in half-whispers to journalists. One described a city within the city under Remenki, with streets wide enough for trucks to pass. Another claimed to have service generators beneath the Kremlin that could run indefinitely without fuel resupply. None of their stories could be verified, but together they painted an image both haunting and plausible, an entire civilization buried alive, perfectly preserved in the dark. Western journalists called it the Moscow Ark. To them, it was a symbol of Cold War madness. To Russians, it became a ghost story, a reminder that even in ruin, the Soviet dream had tried to outlive its own death. In 1992, a Moscow television program aired a segment titled Metro 2, Myth or Reality. The producers claimed to have obtained maps showing a secret line running from the Kremlin to Vnukovo airport. The broadcast sparked national fascination and swift government discomfort. Days later, the Defense Ministry issued a terse statement: "We do not comment on facilities related to national security." The phrasing was deliberate, not a denial. It was the kind of answer that said everything by saying nothing. As the 1990s unfolded, urban explorers began probing the city's underbelly. They discovered sealed shafts, forgotten stairwells, and tunnels that ended in reinforced doors humming with electricity. Some swore they heard the faint vibration of trains moving somewhere far below. Others found evidence of new wiring, fresh paint, or recent footprints in the dust. It became clear that parts of the network were still alive, maintained, guarded, and modernized by someone. Yet no one in authority ever admitted as much. Moscow had changed flags and leaders, but its deepest secret had survived untouched. By the turn of the millennium, a new Russia had emerged, proud, modern, and ambitious, yet beneath its polished streets, the old infrastructure still pulsed. The underground city, once a sanctuary for the Soviet elite, had become a silent witness to history, a buried reminder that even as nations crumble, the things they fear most never truly disappear. By the early 2000s, Russia was no longer the fading superpower the world had pitted through the 1990s. Oil money flowed again, the economy steadied, and Moscow began to reassert itself as a power reborn. But with that revival came an older instinct, the Soviet reflex to prepare for catastrophe. The new century brought new weapons, new threats, and a familiar fear that history might yet repeat itself. Beneath the glass towers and luxury boulevards of the modern capital, construction began again. Only this time, the noise was quieter, the permits more secret, and the ground beneath Moscow stirred once more. Urban rumors returned in force. Residents near the Kremlin reported heavy trucks arriving after midnight, their cargo covered in tarpaulins. Metro maintenance crews spoke of entire sections suddenly closed off with no explanation. One man, a subcontractor for a state energy firm, described laying power cables for a facility that did not appear on any municipal grid. The work was paid in cash, and the coordinates he was given pointed suspiciously close to the old Remenki district, the heart of the Cold War's buried city. Western intelligence agencies, too, noticed. Satellite imagery from the early 2000s revealed a flurry of underground excavation sites across Moscow and the Urals. Analysts at NATO command centers debated whether Russia was expanding its Cold War bunker system. In 2011, the U.S. Defense Intelligence Agency published a short but alarming assessment. Evidence suggests the existence of an extensive underground infrastructure capable of sustaining critical command functions in the event of nuclear exchange. The report noted ventilation shafts disguised within new government complexes and heat signatures matching subterranean power generation. Officially, Moscow dismissed the claim as paranoid fantasy. Unofficially, the denials came too quickly. Meanwhile, Russia's internal defense planning underwent a quiet transformation. The concept of continuity of government, once a relic of Soviet paranoia, became doctrine again. President and Security Council officials began to conduct emergency drills, descending into undisclosed locations beneath the city. Rumors swirled that the old Metro 2 tunnels had been reinforced and connected to newly built shelters capable of housing tens of thousands. Civil defense agencies were revived. New directives ordered federal ministries to maintain underground command centers. What had begun as a Soviet myth was quietly reborn as a 21st-century reality. Civil engineers who worked on large infrastructure projects began to notice odd restrictions. Blueprints for metro expansions contained unexplained gaps, areas labeled simply as declassified corridor. Access was restricted by the Federal Protective Service, the same organization responsible for the security of the Kremlin and the president. A few curious journalists attempted to investigate and were swiftly warned off. One Moscow reporter wrote in a private blog, "You can photograph any street in this city, except the ones that don't exist." The new century also brought new motivations. The nuclear threat had never disappeared, but now there were cyber attacks, hypersonic missiles, and the fear of orbital weapons. To those in power, the old bunkers were not relics, they were insurance. Beneath Moscow, under layers of history and paranoia, the Kremlin once again prepared for a world that might end without warning. By the 2010s, the city skyline gleamed with glass and neon, but its foundations were older than ever. Beneath shopping malls and business towers ran sealed corridors whose blueprints dated back half a century. Maintenance logs from energy stations recorded unexplained power draws at night. In some places, vibrations from deep drilling could be felt through the pavement. It was as though Moscow had two pulses again, one in the daylight of modern ambition, and another in the buried heartbeat of its Cold War past. In the 21st century, the underground city had not vanished. It had evolved, modernized, and adapted, ready once more to protect the few while the rest of the world looked up, unaware, at a sky that could still fall. Every nation prepares for war, but only a few prepare for the end of the world. The Soviet Union had done it out of fear, modern Russia was doing it out of calculation. The philosophy that guided both was the same, continuity above humanity. To the Kremlin, survival was not about saving lives, it was about preserving control. The underground city, the bunkers, the sealed corridors, they were not refuges for the people. They were instruments of governance, built on the assumption that when civilization failed, authority must not. In military doctrine, this was called post-strike functionality, the ability of the state to operate after absorbing a nuclear blow. On paper, it was a technical term, a matter of cables, power grids, and communication nodes. But behind it lay something darker, a quiet acceptance that millions could die while a few would inherit the silence. The blueprints of survival had always been drawn with hierarchy in mind. The surface would burn, but below, the command structure would live on, its chain of authority uninterrupted, its machinery of order untouched. Even in apocalypse, bureaucracy would remain intact. This cold pragmatism revealed a truth that transcended ideology. Whether capitalist or communist, every superpower shared the same obsession, to endure. During the Cold War, Washington and Moscow had mirrored each other like reflections in a nuclear mirror, each building bunkers, each drafting secret succession plans, each testing how long command could function without sunlight. In both systems, survival became sacred, and secrecy the highest currency. The difference was only one of tone. America buried its fears in mountains, the Soviet Union buried them beneath its capital. But the true secret of survival was not physical at all, it was psychological. For decades, the Kremlin taught its citizens that the state was eternal, that the party, the motherland, and history itself would never perish. That belief became the foundation of its power. Yet beneath that confidence lay the engineering of despair, entire cities built on the assumption that the surface world would die. To live under such a system was to exist in constant contradiction, to believe in permanence while preparing for extinction. In a sense, the underground city represented the soul of the Soviet experiment. It was discipline without compassion, vision without humanity. Its designers spoke in the language of engineering but worked in the theology of survival. They imagined corridors that would echo with order long after the world above had turned to dust. They believed that civilization could continue as long as there were phones to connect, files to sign, and a chain of command to obey. It was a belief both rational and tragic, a faith in structure over spirit. Yet there was also something undeniably human in their effort. Beneath all the secrecy and fear, the underground city was proof of a universal instinct, the refusal to vanish. The same drive that built space stations and submarines also built bunkers. Humanity, confronted with annihilation, does not surrender, it digs. In tunnels or in memory, it seeks continuity. Whether the Kremlin's hidden metropolis still exists in full or not, it stands as a testament to that paradox, the brilliance of our survival instinct and the blindness of our pride. Above Moscow, life goes on as if nothing lies below. Children play in parks that rest over concrete roofs. Cars pass over sealed entrances long forgotten. But somewhere in the depths, lights may still flicker, machines may still hum, and oxygen may still circulate through the arteries of a sleeping city. The machinery of survival waits, timeless and indifferent, for the moment it was built to endure. Beneath the streets of modern Moscow lies a world built from fear, faith, and engineering genius, a silent relic of an age that never truly ended. The underground city, whether fully functional or fading into myth, remains one of the most haunting legacies of the 20th century. It represents not just the architecture of survival, but the psychology of a civilization that prepared to die standing, or to live forever underground. Every layer of concrete, every sealed corridor, carries the imprint of an era when humanity believed destruction was inevitable and endurance was the only form of victory. Today, the city above glitters with ambition. Towers of glass reflect a skyline once dominated by the red stars of ideology. Cafes fill the boulevards where tanks once rolled. The metro itself, grand, bright, alive, moves millions through the same soil that hides the ghost tunnels of Metro 2. Yet, for all its transformation, the capital still stands on a buried inheritance, a nervous system of steel and stone that whispers of a different Moscow, one that was built not to live, but to outlast. To the historian, the story of the underground Kremlin and the Remenki complex is a study in extremes, how fear can drive a nation to feats of impossible scale, and how secrecy can become a kind of faith. The Soviet Union collapsed, its symbols dismantled, its dreams reduced to memory. But the network below survived, at least in part, because it was designed to. It needed no ideology, no loyalty, no politics. It was pure function, an embodiment of the state's instinct to persist beyond its own death. In that sense, the underground city is not only a Soviet relic, it is a mirror held up to the entire human condition. Every society builds something it hopes will outlast catastrophe: pyramids, fortresses, data vaults, bunkers. The Kremlin's hidden metropolis was simply the 20th century's version of immortality, a place where power could hide from apocalypse and declare itself eternal. Yet history reminds us that no structure, however deep or strong, can escape the erosion of time. Concrete cracks. Machines rust. Memory fades. Even the most secret world will one day be unearthed by those who were never meant to see it. Still, there is something almost poetic in the thought that somewhere below the traffic and neon, the hum of air recyclers might still echo through forgotten corridors. Maybe a light still glows in a sealed chamber, powered by a generator that no one remembers how to shut off. Maybe dust lies undisturbed on desks that once held maps of the apocalypse. And maybe, in those depths, the air still carries the faint vibration of an idea, that life, in any form, must go on. The Soviet Union no longer exists, but its shadow endures in silence, stretching through the tunnels carved beneath the heart of Russia. The legacy of that underground world is not just concrete or secrecy, it is the echo of human will. A reminder that even in our most destructive age, we refuse to vanish. We built in darkness to preserve light. And so, beneath the feet of millions who walk the avenues of Moscow, history still breathes, quiet, hidden, eternal. The world above has changed, but the one below never stopped waiting.